Hello, friends. This is Professor Joseph Holbrook. We are continuing our series on Introduction to the History of Christianity. We are in week 10. This is the part 2 of my week 10 lectures on the Victorian crisis of faith in the long 19th century in Europe. Last week, or earlier this week, we talked about the Napoleonic Wars, about Feuerbach and Marx, and the Marxist reductionist definition or understanding of religion. And now then we talked about Charles Darwin and the origin of the species, which led to a significant undermining of credible belief in the in revelatory or religions of revelation, which depend on a special revelation through scripture, such as Christianity, Islam, Judaism. And so now we want to talk about the Victorian crisis of faith, which resulted from all of these factors combined, converging together. The textbook points out that there's no doubt that Darwin moved away from what we would call conventional Christianity at some point in the 1840s, although it's not known if he ever became an atheist. There's a substantial theoretical gap between abandoning Orthodox Christian faith versus becoming an atheist. Just because someone ceases to identify with one of the major Christian traditions or with Orthodox Christianity does not mean they cease to identify to believe in a creator. And that's, of course, a growing phenomenon today with the rise of the nuns, none of the above, in the Pew Research polls and the Gallup polling. So the Victorian crisis of faith, in which Darwin was both a spectator and a participant, can be understood as a shift away from the specifics of Christianity towards a more generic concept of God. It's generally accepted that religious belief in England and many European countries went through a period of decline and uncertainty during this long 19th century, particularly towards the end of the period. England's status as an economic, military, and cultural power gave these developments a particular significance in England. We also had the rise of biblical criticism, which is the attempt to apply a rational social science techniques and tools to textual study, textual criticism, understanding the Bible as a text that can be analyzed using these tools. This was on the rise in the second half of the 19th century. Benjamin Jowett wrote on the interpretation of Scripture, which argued that the Bible should be read like any other book. The impact of this collection of essays was probably greater than it otherwise might have been, as it was published a year after Darwin's Origin of the Species, which initiated a debate about the reliability of the Bible, as the Bible's account of human origins. So this then opens up the tension or conflict between faith and science, which is still with many church traditions today. The popular influence of science was growing and becoming more credible in society. It was increasingly coming to be seen as a cultural authority which was independent and critical of religion. Darwinian debates added significantly to these discussions. For later Victorians, science was all about the future. Religion was about the past. This perception was intensified by books about the warfare between science and faith. In 1874, a book was published, The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. In 1896, another book was published with the title History of Warfare of Science and Theology in Christendom. So this kind of rhetoric did not help. It increased the perception that science and faith were incompatible. At the same time that these cultural shifts and shifts in worldview were taking place, there was also a number of political developments, particularly in Italy and Germany. And in Italy, we have what is called the I'm not sure how to pronounce it in Italian. I'm going to just pronounce it the best I can. Risorgimento. Risorgimento. The Italian reunification. I think it means probably the reorganization. So after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, the papacy went through a major time of difficulty, particularly in South and Central America and Mexico, with the Spanish Empire breaking up and breaking into modern nation states, modern independent republics, which caused great difficulties for the papacy, which had seen Latin America as its greatest area of growth in terms of Catholic adherence. Pius VI was evicted from Rome by revolutionary armies, Italian revolutionary armies, and spent the last 6 months of his life exiled in France. During this time, the French Church, Catholic Church, was seen as the ever faithful, the daughter of the Church. The Pope's situation was made much more difficult after the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. One of the results of the Napoleonic Wars was a major uptick in nationalism, not only in Latin America, which saw the Spanish Empire breaking up into modern nation states, but also in Europe during this time. Because of the Napoleonic Wars, countries were becoming modern nation states and turning away from the old principalities that were under the nobility, the old monarchical system. Spain adopted a new liberal constitution in 1812, which was followed by Portugal in 1822. These developments were seen as moving away from the older system of absolute monarchical rule towards a more democratic approach to government. And this brings us to the Kingdom of Italy, which had been a patchwork of principalities ruled by the Pope and also by the Holy Roman Emperor and other noble families. But the Risorgimento continued, eventually leading to the formation of a single Italian kingdom in 1861. Although Garibaldi, who was the patriot and nationalist hero of Italy, and his circle wanted to form an Italian republic, they were too heavily dependent on support from Victor Emmanuel II, who was the king of Sardinia, whose military resources were instrumental to the success of the campaign for reunification. So Victor Emmanuel's defeat of papal forces in 1860 led to his excommunication by the Pope. Did you hear that? Let me read it again. Victor Emmanuel's defeat of papal forces in 1860. This highlights a problem going back to Constantine in 325 AD of the union of faith and the sword, the power of the state or the empire. The Pope had his own forces, his own military arm that enforced his will as a political leader, but they were defeated in 1860 and led to his excommunication of Victor Emmanuel, which is hardly fair to be able to wield that weapon against a political opponent. There's a lot of lessons there for us today in our current situation in the United States as we see the rise of Christian nationalism. Not a good idea. So now you see that the Pope is losing political power and this is really bad PR for the Catholic Church. The political events of this period consolidated the perception that within Italy, that the papacy was hostile to any forms of political liberalism or nationalism and unalterably opposed to democratic ideals. I must say this perception of the papacy also included most of Latin America, the Spanish territories in South America, Central America, even Brazil. The papacy was seen as a hostile force to any form of modernization or liberalism, republicanism, democracy in general. Democracy was considered one of the enemies of faith. It's too bad when religious leaders take the wrong side in history. It looks bad. Although the new Italian government took no action against the Pope, it permitted him to receive ambassadors. Pius IX, also known as Pius Nono, which is the Italian word for nine, was in effect confined to the territory of the Vatican for the remainder of his life. Papal properties elsewhere in Rome became the residence of the Italian king after they were confiscated from the papacy. So the Pope has now lost political power and is confined to a small area of the Vatican within Rome, unable to leave, defensive, undoubtedly frustrated, Pius IX. And so it's in this context that the Pope calls for a Vatican Council, 1869. This is the First Vatican Council. The reemergence of the Pope as a major figure within Catholicism occurred during this time, partly as a result of the loss of political power. The papacy regained spiritual power. In the decades prior to the French Revolution, the Pope seems to have been largely ignored by the Catholic faithful, who regarded him as isolated and distant. However, Napoleon's dismissive treatment of the Pope caused him to regain his prestige in the eyes of both the faithful as well as some of the conservative European governments. Even in France, the heartland of movements which advocated nationally governed churches, there was a new respect for the Pope, however grudging. Let me explain that. The church, under Henry VIII, the Church of England, which was Catholic, broke away from the papacy and formed the Church of England, which was basically Catholicism without the Pope, although it later became influenced by Calvinism and Protestant doctrines. But England was the only place where this has been successful. There were attempts in France during the French Revolution to detach the French Catholic Church from the papacy and develop a Church of France similar to the Church of England, but it ultimately failed. During the Mexican Revolution in the early part of the 20th century, there was also an attempt in Mexico to separate the Catholic Church of Mexico from the papacy and form a Catholic Church of Mexico. But that also failed. So the only place this has succeeded was in the Church of England, which formed a national church, which then gradually came under the influence of Protestantism. So this is why it mentions that France was the heartland of movements which advocated nationally governed churches. This leaves the papacy as an interesting international force, which counteracts some of the trend towards nationalism during this period. And this brings us to a concept known as ultramontanism. Let me see if I can pull this up. Let's see, where is this? Okay. Yeah, I'm I'm having a little trouble getting there, but here we go. Ultramontanism. So this is a concept of that this is an idea that reinforces the power of the Vatican, the power of the papacy, as an international force. And this was a very big factor particularly in Brazil at the end of the 19th century, but also in a lot of other Latin American countries. Ultramontanism is a emphasis on the authority of the Pope and the submission of the national churches to the papacy, the international authority of the papacy. And Ultramontanism comes from a French perspective of over the mountains. Ultramontanism, over the Alps. So the French saw their spiritual authority, the French Catholics, their spiritual authority is coming from over the mountains, over the Alps, from Rome. And it's a movement which advocates increased papal authority known as Ultramontanism, from a Latin root meaning beyond the mountains. Paradoxically, such agitation for increased papal authority in Northern Europe came at a time when the Pope's position in Italy was severely weakened by the Risorgimento. So this brings us now to, I've got two mics here that I'm trying not to get confused. It gets complicated, right? I've got a complicated recording system here. Bear with me. So this brings us to the concept of papal infallibility. Papal infallibility. One of the latest, when I say latest, I mean one of the most recent doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. This emerged at the First Vatican Council. The council was called to strengthen the church against nationalists, liberals, materialists. Actually, the list could go on quite lengthy. Democrats could be included in this, those who espouse democracy, Republicans who espouse a Republican form of government, anyone who had challenged some of the leading themes of Catholic faith and deprived the Church of control of schools and property in various parts of Europe, including Italy. So this council issued two major documents. De Filius reasserted the harmony between reason and faith, and the supremacy of the latter, that is, faith. And Pastor Aeternus, eternal pastor, set out the doctrine of papal infallibility. And now we go on to the situation in Germany, and somewhat in contrast to Italy. The similarity between Germany and Italy is that they both were latecomers to the modern statehood. England, France, Spain, Holland all became modern nation states well before Germany and Italy. And that was partly because of religious reasons, and also the fact that both Germany and Italy were a patchwork of principalities ruled by noble families or by the Holy Roman Emperor or papal territories. And this is true in Germany as well as Italy, which the Congress of Vienna, which had taken place immediately after the Napoleonic Wars, left Germany as a patchwork of small states. None of them were capable of exercising influence at the continental level. A turning point was reached when Wilhelm I became King of Prussia. Interestingly enough, also in 1861, the same year that Italy was reunited, Wilhelm appointed Otto von Bismarck, who lived from 1850 to 1898, as President and Foreign Minister of Prussia. Prussia was largely a Protestant area of Germany. Bismarck launched a war with Austria in 1866, in which a highly efficient Prussian army defeated its Austrian enemy. In 1871, then, he launched a intellectual or Yes, a cultural or intellectual attack on the Catholic Church of Prussia. You might ask why he would do that. One reason is that Bismarck himself was a Protestant with pietist influences, which would be not that far away from a modern day evangelical, which also has pietistic influences. That's probably a stretch. I shouldn't say that. But he was like a 19th century Prussian evangelical. We could say that. In a series of repressive measures introduced over the period from 71 to 1875, Bismarck aimed to reduce the influence of the Catholic Church in Prussia. I will say there's kind of a rule. If you look at the 19th century, even earlier, there is a rise of strong anti-clerical sentiment throughout the world, especially areas where the Catholic Church had great influence, or anywhere there was a state, officially sanctioned church by the state, particularly Catholic. And so in Prussia, you see Bismarck trying to reduce the influence of Catholicism in Prussia. Why? Because they had a lot of influence, political and economic influence, which interfered with some of their attempts at reform and restructuring. The same thing happened in Mexico, first in the Mexican Civil War in the 19th century, then later in the early 20th in the Mexican Revolution. They made real attempts to repress Catholicism, made it illegal to have to offer for priests to offer mass. Then later you see in the French Catholic Church, they make Catholicism illegal and begin to repress, pass laws that people are not allowed to wear any clothing or symbols of religion, such as a cross or priestly garb, or nuns were not allowed to wear their garb. That was in France. All of these occasions of anti-clericalism or anti-religion come wherever the church had official state power and economic power, and people became resentful of the economic and political power of religion interfering in their lives. This is something that contemporary people, contemporary conservatives in the United States needs to be aware of, because it can backfire. This attempt to seize political and economic power and to shape society. So this happened in Prussia, and Bismarck began to legislate against the Catholic Church. He didn't make any attempt to interfere with southern Germany. There was German states like Bavaria, where Catholicism was much more deeply embedded. Bavaria never really went through the Protestant Reformation. Many German intellectuals were enraged by the decision of the First Vatican Council concerning papal infallibility, which was seen as highly authoritarian. Catholicism was portrayed as a reactionary movement totally out of place in a modern nation state such as Germany. So in a series of repressive measures, Bismarck introduced he introduced measures to try to limit the influence of Catholicism. In 1875, he abolished all Catholic religious orders. They removed all state subsidies to the Catholic Church. They eliminated all religious safeguards from the Prussian Constitution. In 1876, all the Prussian bishops were either in prison or exile, and the Catholic Church, of course, decided to resist these laws. And so this was going on while the First Vatican Council was taking place in Rome. And obviously this left the bishops in Rome at the First Vatican Council feeling a bit defensive. And something else was going on during this time in the intellectual field or the academic field, which is the rise of modernism. which was portrayed as a serious threat to the well-being of the church. Now, this is a specific kind of modernism. There's a lot of different aspects and dimensions to modernism, but here we're specifically talking about Roman Catholic modernism, modernism within the Roman Catholic Church, and it was best understood as linked with the rise of the Enlightenment in Europe. So this Catholic modernism involved a significant amount of theological revisionism. It was an attempt by writers within the Catholic Church to come to terms with the outlook of the Enlightenment, which theology often does. It's in dialogue with philosophy, and it had until that point been largely ignored. We're not trying to conflate this Italian Catholic modernism with British or French or American modernism, or even Protestant modernism with Roman Catholic modernism. They all have their unique and distinctive factors or dimensions. It's best seen here as referring to a set of attitudes shaped by the intellectual center or culture of the Enlightenment. So a couple examples of Catholic modernists: Alfred Loisy and George Tyrrell were two of the most influential. During the 1890s, Loisy established himself as the critic of traditional views of biblical accounts of creation and argued that a real development of doctrine could be discerned within Scripture. Loisy questioned if the institutional church was to be regarded as God's intention for the world. The most famous sentence of his book, The Gospel and the Church, makes this point succinctly. He says Jesus proclaimed the kingdom, but what actually came was the church. So this is an emphasis on Jesus' message of the kingdom and setting it off in antithesis to the church. The work suggests that Christian doctrine has developed over time rather than being delivered to the apostles as a fixed and permanent package. This viewpoint has already been advocated with some caution by John Henry Newman, a British bishop, Catholic bishop, earlier in the century. It was, however, seen as a concession to evolutionist ways of thinking in this context, and therefore being as inconsistent with received Catholic tradition. British Protestant modernism was also an issue. A book called The Idea of Atonement in Christian Theology argued that the theory of atonement associated with the medieval writer Peter Abelard was more acceptable to modern thought forms than traditional theories which made an appeal to the notion of substitutionary sacrifice. This moral or exemplarist theory of atonement interpreted Christ's death as a demonstration of the love of God, and it made a considerable impact on the English, especially Anglican thought, in the 1920s and 30s. In the United States, there was also a movement towards modernism. The growth of liberal Protestantism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was widely perceived as a direct challenge to the more conservative evangelical standpoints. Pius X, in September 1907, waged war against the Catholic modernism with his encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis, the feeding of the Lord's flock, and began to excommunicate modernist thinkers and writers within the Catholic Church. And this brings us up pretty much to the end of the 19th century, and we will continue next week with more of our introduction to Christian history, moving into the 20th century. Thank you very much for your time and your kind attention, and please reach out to me and let me know if you have any questions at all. Thank you.